Well, good morning. My name is Roger Handberg. I'm the United States Attorney for the Middle District of Florida. I'm honored to be here today with representatives from several of my law enforcement partners to talk about one of our federal prosecutions. And so I'm going to start from your left to your right. We've got Group Supervisor Casey Cook with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. We have Colonel Chris Rule with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office. We have Chris Daniel, who's the Director of Public Safety with the University of South Florida Police Department. And we've got FBI Acting Special Agent in Charge, Rodney Crawford. I appreciate these law enforcement partners being with me here today and for the important role that they play in combating what I believe is the deadliest drug threat that our country has ever faced, and that's fentanyl. Every year, the Florida Medical Examiners publish a report of the number of deaths caused by drugs in Florida. In 2010, the Florida Medical Examiners reported that fentanyl caused 114 deaths. Since then, the number of deaths caused by fentanyl in Florida has increased over 4,800%. Deaths caused by fentanyl in Florida first topped 500 in 2015. They increased to over 1,000 in 2016, over 2,000 in 2018, over 3,000 in 2019, and over 5,000 in 2020. In 2022, which is the year we have data most recently, fentanyl was responsible for 5,622 deaths in Florida. Florida is not alone in experiencing an increase in fentanyl overdose deaths. From 2019 to 2021, fentanyl deaths across the United States increased approximately 94%. Fentanyl is now the leading cause of death. It is the leading cause of death for Americans age 18 to 44. And it has been a major contributor to the opioid epidemic. As the United States Attorney for the Middle District of Florida, I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer for 35 counties in Florida. Because of the terrible toll that fentanyl has taken on communities that my office serves, my office has increased our resources to prosecute more of those cases in federal court. Over the last 2 fiscal years, we have doubled the number of prosecutions of fentanyl defendants. These cases have resulted in large seizures of fentanyl. My district covers the second largest population in the country. We serve over 13 million people. Over the past 2 fiscal years, our law enforcement partners have seized enough fentanyl in our federal cases and related law enforcement operations to kill every single person in this district 5 times over. In recent years, there has been a troubling trend. Drug dealers are pressing pills to look like legitimate pharmaceuticals, often using fentanyl as part of their deadly mix. The case that I'm here to talk about today involves such an incident. On February 16th of 2024, a University of South Florida student was found dead in his dorm room. The University of South Florida Police Department responded immediately to the scene and began their investigation. An autopsy would later reveal that the student died from an accidental lethal dose of fentanyl. There were no other lethal drugs in his system. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office quickly joined the investigation, and those 2 agencies conducted a thorough and expeditious investigation. As a result of that, they found that the student had unknowingly purchased fentanyl from Darius Gustafson. The victim had not asked for fentanyl, which is something that we often see in these cases. Instead, the victim asked for and believed that he was receiving Percocet. But that is not what Gustafson delivered. Instead, Gustafson delivered the fentanyl that caused the victim's death. The law enforcement agencies on this case are skilled in investigating drug trafficking cases, and in this case, they did what they do so well in every overdose case. They conducted a thorough and methodical investigation in which they followed up on each and every lead. Their goals were to do justice for the victim, to hold accountable everyone who was involved in causing the victim's death, and to prevent any further deaths. This case was a top priority of each of their agencies, and they worked this case quickly. In less than 4 months, their investigation resulted in 4 defendants being indicted by a federal grand jury for their role in causing the victim's death. A key part of this investigation were undercover purchases that were made by Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office detectives from Gustafson. In each of those transactions, Gustafson sold pills that looked like Percocet, but that were actually fentanyl. In total, the undercover officers made 3 purchases totaling more than 400 fentanyl pills from Gustafson. On February 27th, a transaction for 2 pills. That same day on February 27th, another transaction for 100 pills. And on March 7th, a transaction for 300 pills. Those undercover purchases were an important part of building the case in identifying the 3 other members of the conspiracy. Investigators determined that Gustafson's source of fentanyl was David Chudhabuddhi. That Chudhabuddhi's partner in supplying fentanyl was Marquise Trant, and that Chudhabuddhi and Trant were supplied with fentanyl by Miguel Cintron. This was a thorough investigation. The investigators on this case did not stop after making the 3 controlled purchases from Gustafson. They continued with their investigation, building a case against the other 3 conspirators. As part of that investigation, an undercover officer made 2 separate purchases of 300 pills from Chudhabuddhi on March 28th and April 10th. Chudhabuddhi and Trant were arrested on April 10th. But that was not the end of this investigation. On the same day as those arrests, investigators arranged a purchase of pills from Cintron. When he arrived at the location, Cintron was taken into custody. In his vehicle, investigators found approximately 1,500 fentanyl pills. But that was not the end of this investigation. The next day, a search warrant was executed at Cintron's residence, which resulted in the seizure of over 7 kilograms of cocaine, approximately 2 kilograms of heroin, over $200,000 in cash, and 3 firearms. Last week, a federal grand jury returned a 9-count indictment charging the 4 individuals involved in the distribution that led to the victim's death on February 16th. Each of the 4 defendants has been charged with 1 count of conspiring to distribute fentanyl and 1 count of distributing fentanyl that resulted in the victim's death on February 16th. All 4 defendants are also charged with additional counts of distributing fentanyl, and Cintron is further charged with 1 count of being a felon in possession of a firearm and 1 count of possession with intent to distribute cocaine. The allegations contained in the federal indictment and court documents, which I've summarized here this morning, well, they're just that. They're allegations, and each of the defendants in this case is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. These federal charges are serious. All 4 defendants are facing a minimum mandatory of 20 years up to life in federal prison. I want to commend the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, the University of South Florida Police Department, the FBI, and the ATF are working together as a team to develop the evidence that has led to the federal charges in this case. This case is another great example of how local and federal investigators effectively partner to protect our communities by seizing dangerous drugs and arresting and prosecuting defendants who seek to distribute them in our community. The work of the agencies on this case has undoubtedly saved lives. Through the drug seizures and arrests in this case, these law enforcement agencies have removed lethal quantities of fentanyl, cocaine, and heroin from the streets of our community. There are 3 points that I particularly like to make about this case. First, the agencies who worked on this case conducted their investigation quickly and efficiently, with a federal indictment issued less than 4 months after the victim's death. Anyone who deals fentanyl should expect law enforcement in this community and my office to seek to act quickly to protect this community. Second, federal law provides for enhanced penalties for any drug trafficking defendant involved in causing a victim's death. Those enhanced penalties are not limited to the individual who hands the fentanyl to the victim. Rather, the enhanced federal penalty can be applied to anyone who is part of the conspiracy, regardless of whether a defendant even ever met the victim. This case is a good example, with 4 defendants facing a minimum mandatory of 20 years in federal prison for their role in the conspiracy that caused the victim's death. Third, the investigation of fentanyl overdose cases is a top priority of these agencies and every law enforcement agency in this community. It also is a top priority of my office. I mentioned before that my office has doubled our prosecution of fentanyl cases. Several of those have involved deaths caused by fentanyl distribution. In one case, my office federally charged a 7-time convicted felon with distribution of fentanyl that resulted in the death of a victim in Hillsborough County. The defendant went to trial, was convicted, and was sentenced to life in federal prison. In another case, my office federally charged a defendant with conspiracy to distribute heroin and fentanyl that resulted in the death of a Tampa woman. The defendant went to trial, was convicted, and was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. In yet another case, my office federally charged a defendant with distribution of fentanyl in Pinellas and Hillsborough counties that led to a fatal overdose. That defendant went to trial, was convicted, and was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. What we often see in overdose cases is that drug dealers sell drugs knowing that they contain lethal amounts of fentanyl, even although they know that fentanyl is deadly. That was true in the 3 cases I just mentioned, and it is true about the case that we're here to talk about today. And it is one of the many reasons why my office and our law enforcement partners are committed to taking quick action to dismantle any conspiracy involved in the distribution of fentanyl in this community. One pill can kill. Drug traffickers know that, and in my experience, they will not stop unless they are arrested and prosecuted. Let this be a message to anyone who illegally traffics in fentanyl in this community. As you can see from the law enforcement agencies here today, you will be investigated. And if you distribute fentanyl in this community, our agents and investigators will use every lawful tool to hold you accountable for your crimes, no matter where you operate. And if you have violated federal law, the United States Attorney's Office will seek to pursue charges against you in federal court. We are united together in our mission to keep this community safe.